I just want to report we had a very good field trip. We almost had a full bus. We did it. Sadly, 2 people got sick and had to not make it. And we missed you there, Robbie. You weren't able to make it. So is there any first timers here? Okay, good. What we'd like to do is have Bill, our guest speaker, lead us into the pledge. If you please stand.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, thank you very much. Also, just I got to get my mind down. Then we're also doing Zoom. Encourage anybody that can't make it here, they can sign up to Zoom. And also, it is being recorded and used within about a week. Jim Hurt will go ahead and finalize it. It'll be on our website. And I'm going the wrong way. Oh boy. Yeah. Okay, the one just let you know we did that in the back. Like I said, we had a very successful field trip. In October, we had the flyers back there for our October field trip. That's where we're going to be following Jubal early through the Susquehanna. So it's going to be part of the Civil War campaign. But we're going to see a little bit more that what happened leading up to the Battle of Gettysburg. And Scott Mangus, who's been a speaker here, and he was actually 2 tours ago. He was a tour on the 3rd Winchester, the follow-up. And remember, from the 3rd Winchester, that's everybody headed for Gettysburg. So they didn't know they were going to make it to Gettysburg. Also, remember in the back, we do have see Norm. We do have books and magazines, like I say, $3 for hardcover, $2 for softcover, and $1 for the magazines, or you get 3 for $2. And like I said, that helps pay for the expenses for here and also for our speakers and everything. And we do have quite a few books, and what we do, we rotate. So you don't see the same books all the time. And we do have a website that's cwrt.org. So I think it gives us all the information about field trips, our membership, and also like every video that we've been able to that we've recorded is on the website. And before we get started, Tom, you want to talk about the becoming trip?
Okay. Before I introduce our speaker, I talked with Rick on the phone this past week, and if any of you are interested, we're going to do a carpool trip from here, but we're going to be using the bus here, the BB-8 van, and I'm going to do a tour of the farm of Gettysburg. Take you out of some of the farms and other places. I don't know how many know there's a covered bridge on the battlefield. Sykes Bridge. So mark it on your calendar. September the 14th is a Saturday. Okay, if you're interested, within another month or so, we'll have a sign-up sheet, and I don't know what the call will be. But if you're interested, it's not going to cost anything. And we're talking about what we're going to do, like for lunch and so forth. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Mr. William Benzel. He lives in his wife, Lisa, live in Alexandria, Virginia, for about 40 years. He's a retired attorney. He served 12 years on the staff of the U.S. House of Representatives. He has an undergraduate degree at the University of Wisconsin in history. He's also the vice president of the School Board Roundtable, Washington, D.C. And he's also the teacher, lecturer, and guide at the Surratt Museum in Clinton, Maryland. He's also the narrator for the Surratt Society, and he does a tour of the 12 days escape of John Rose Booth, starting at Ford's Theater and ending up in Garrett Farm in Caroline, Virginia. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Benzel. I'd like for us to give him a nice warm welcome.
It is. Thank you, Tom.
Yep.
It really is a pleasure to be with you this evening. For work.
Go ahead, try now. One more, there we go.
With this group, I think I already know the answer. How many, by show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the saga of Mary Surratt? That's what I thought. You all are. Mary Surratt, in 1865, was arrested, tried, and convicted of being a conspirator in the plot to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. And here's the spoiler alert. She was hanged. She has the dubious distinction of being the first woman ever to be executed by the federal government. Now, again, by a show of hands, how many of you, based on what you've read or seen thus far, outside of this presentation, think Mrs. Surratt was innocent? How many think Mrs. Surratt was guilty? How many think Mrs. Surratt was guilty of something, but you're not quite sure of what? That's the usual response. And that's what we're going to talk about here this evening. Okay. Who was Mary Surratt? Mary Surratt was born in 1823 in Prince George's County, Maryland. And actually the land that she was born on is now part of Andrews Air Force Base. In fact, her home, what it is believed, is situated on what is now the golf course at Andrews Air Force Base. Her maiden name was Jenkins. And when Mary was 2 years old, her father, Archibald, died. Elizabeth Jenkins never remarried. That was very unusual for a widow with 3 small children. Mary had 2 brothers. And usually the widow would remarry fairly quickly, or at the very least, move back to her parents' farm. Not Elizabeth Jenkins. She was a very capable individual, very strong-willed, very ably ran the family farm. So much so that when Mary was 12 years old, Mrs. Jenkins could afford to send her off to boarding school in Alexandria at a school affiliated with St. Mary's Catholic Church. Mary converted to Catholicism, and throughout the rest of her life was a very devout Catholic. In 1840, when Mary was 17, she married 27-year-old John Harrison Surratt. Within 4 years, next one, yeah. Within 4 years, they had 3 children: Isaac, Elizabeth Susanna, that they called Anna, and John Harrison Surratt Jr. In 1852, John Surratt Sr. purchased 287 acres of land in Prince George's County. And he had a structure built on the crossroads of an east-west road called the Piscataway Marlborough Road and a new north-south road that they had just cut through the trees. And they gave that road a very clever name. They called it the New Cut Road. The structure was to serve as the Surratt family home and also as a place of business. Surratt was licensed to run what was called an ordinary. So it was a tavern. It provided meals to the public, and it provided overnight lodging for travelers. We know that the structure was red. And that's because Mr. Surratt wasn't always good about paying his bills. And Jeremiah Townsend, who had been hired to build the structure, never got around to painting the building white. It was red, it's a primer coat, and red paint got its color back then from iron oxide, rust. And so it was the cheapest paint you could use. And that's why you see so many red barns in the eastern United States. It was the cheapest paint. Backwards. As I said, it was a tavern. And in 1854, John Surratt Sr. was named postmaster of the area. And at that point, new settlements took their name from the postmaster. And so the area became known as Surrattsville. And to this day, in Annapolis, the capital of Maryland, it's still called Surratt's District. After Surratt was known as postmaster, it was briefly called Roby's Town. And they figured out you can't keep changing the name of the town every time the postmaster died. And so it became known as Clinton, Maryland, in 1878. Excuse me. 1878. At the time, mail was not delivered to your home. You had to go to the post office and retrieve your mail. So men would gather in the tavern. They'd have an adult beverage or two. They'd collect their mail. They would play cards or checkers. Usually there was gambling going on. And they played a disgusting game of who could hit the spittoon from furthest away. A woman would not have set foot in the tavern. It's the Victorian era, it just was not proper. So if a lady stopped by to pick up her mail, she would tap on the window that you see off to the right. The window would be raised, the mail would be retrieved and handed out through the window. Who knew that the concept behind the McDonald's drive-through originated as the tavern, in addition to being the post office, it became a polling place and a stagecoach stop. Okay, 1861 Civil War began. Isaac, the oldest son, went off and joined a Confederate cavalry unit in Texas. Anna was at home with her parents. John Jr. was at St. Charles College in what they called back then Ellicott Mills. We call it Ellicott City today, just outside of Baltimore. Now keep in mind, at the start of the Civil War, Maryland was a slave state. And Lincoln was not very popular in all of Maryland. He got less than 2.5% of the popular vote in the election in the 1860s. The Surratts had enslaved people, as did most of the farms back then, because they were heavily dependent on enslaved labor to grow the cash crop of tobacco. So as I said, Lincoln was not so popular. In fact, you can count on one finger the total number of votes, popular votes, Lincoln received in all of Prince George's County. One. So as the Surratts were Southern sympathizers, most of their neighbors were as well. People are familiar with the Underground Railroad, and that was a series of safe houses where escaped enslaved persons could move from point to point, house to house, through the South, into the North, and on to freedom. People don't recognize that there was also a Confederate underground. And that was a series of safe houses that came down out of Washington, down through Southern Maryland, to the Potomac, and then on to Richmond. And the Confederate underground worked the same way. In reverse, from Richmond through Southern Maryland into Washington. And once you got to Washington, you pretty much could go wherever you wanted to go. It wasn't that difficult to move around. Surratt's Tavern was a Confederate safe house. How do we know that? We know that because of documents that were captured in Richmond at the end of the Civil War, specifically named Surratt's Tavern, not a house in Surrattsville, but Surratt's Tavern as being a Confederate safe house. So throughout the Civil War, Confederate agents, spies, couriers, messengers are moving through Surratt's Tavern, either on their way to Richmond or from Richmond. In August of 1862, whether it was the 25th or the 26th, depends on which newspaper account got it right, John Surratt Sr. died. He probably died of a stroke. Throughout their marriage, Mrs. Surratt complained constantly that her husband was his own best customer in the bar, and that he was habitually and continuously drunk. So Mary Surratt now has to run the tavern, not a proper position for a woman to be in. So she asked John Jr. to drop out of school and return home, which he does. But he's 18 years old. He's got Confederate spies and couriers and messengers that are coming through the tavern. And he thinks, what excitement, what adventure. So he becomes a Confederate courier. And by the end of the Civil War, he is such a trusted courier that he has direct access to Judah Benjamin, the Confederate Secretary of State, who was also in charge of Confederate covert missions and activities. They called them Secret Service missions back then. But so Surratt is running messages from Judah Benjamin in Richmond up to Confederate operatives and agents who are working in Canada. What are the Confederates doing in Canada? I'll talk about that in a minute. So Mrs. Surratt makes a very fateful decision in the fall of 1864. John Jr. is not around, so she decides to move the family, herself and Anna, and John Jr. when he's actually home, to another property that the Surratts own at 541 H Street. It's Mrs. Surratt's intention to run the H Street property as a boarding house. The start of the Civil War, the population of DC and of Washington was around 70,000 people. By 1864, that number had more than doubled. There were not enough hotel rooms, there were not enough apartments, there just simply wasn't enough housing. So anybody who had any extra room in their house tended to rent those rooms out and run their house as a boarding house. It was a very respectable profession for a woman, and Mrs. Surratt had no problems filling the house with boarders. Incidentally, as you can see on the photo on the right, the structure still stands. It's just east of the Arch in Chinatown area of Washington, D.C., not far from the Capital One Arena. And is in fact a Chinese restaurant. It's now 604 H90, but it's a Chinese restaurant. And the name of the restaurant is The Walk and Roll. You can't make this stuff up. But it still stands. As I said, the inside has been completely gutted. There's nothing original left on the inside, but the facade, the exterior, looks very much as it did in 1864. Okay. In mid-October of 1864, a 26-year-old actor checked into the St. Lawrence Hall Hotel in Montreal, Canada. The St. Lawrence Hall Hotel was the unofficial Confederate headquarters in Canada. Again, why Canada? Because Canada at the time was still a colony of England. England was a neutral country, and by virtue of extension, Canada was a neutral country. Consequently, the Confederates took advantage of that and plotted and planned a number of excursions, such as the St. Albans raid, the attempt to burn down New York City, various excursions on the Great Lakes and then the Midwest. Because once the Canadians the Confederates got back across the Canadian border, the Union couldn't touch it. They couldn't be captured. And it was very easy to get back and forth across the border. So the actor, of course, was John Wilkes Booth. When Booth left the St. Lawrence Hall Hotel 9 days later, the end of October, he had two very important things. One, he had details of a plan to kidnap Abraham Lincoln, and he had letters of introduction to two Confederate agents who were in Maryland by the name of Dr. William Queen and Dr. Samuel Mudd. Now, why kidnap the president? And that's because at the start of the Civil War, at the conclusion of a battle, Confederates would sit down with Union officials and they would exchange a like number of prisoners. And those men would be put right back into the ranks. It got very complicated, how many privates you exchange for a colonel, but they worked all of that out. And it was working until some guy by the name of Ulysses S. Grant came along, and he said, wait a minute, this is nuts. If we deprive the South of their men, they'll run out of men, and the war will come to an end. And that's exactly what was starting to happen in the fall of 1864. The South was running out of men. They were desperate to get the prisoner of war exchange restarted. So they thought if they could capture Lincoln, it's funny, in the North we tend to say kidnap Lincoln, and in the South we some seem to say capture Lincoln. If they could capture Lincoln, take him to Richmond, they could use him to negotiate a restart of the prisoner of war exchange and maybe recognition of the Confederacy. Okay. So in early November of 1864, Booth makes his way to Washington. He's there for a couple of days. In early November, he takes the stagecoach down to Bryantown, Maryland, and he's introduced to Dr. William Queen. Booth spends Saturday night with the Queens. Sunday morning, Booth goes to Mass at St. Mary's Catholic Church with the Queens. The Queens were Catholic, Booth was not. And while they're at church that day, Booth is introduced to Dr. Samuel Mudd. Now, it was not unusual for Dr. Mudd to be at Mass on Sunday morning. He was a Catholic. But St. Mary's was not his parish. St. Mary's was over 7 miles from Dr. Mudd's house. Mudd's parish was St. Peter's, which was less than 2 miles from his house. So this chance meeting at St. Mary's Catholic Church in early November has all the appearance of being a prearranged meeting. Booth makes a second trip down to Bryantown, Maryland, in mid-December of 1864, and again spends Saturday night at the Queens, goes to Mass again at St. Mary's. Who happens to be at that Mass? Dr. Samuel Mudd. This time Booth goes home with Dr. Mudd. He spends Monday night at Mudd. He spent Monday morning, Dr. Mudd and Booth walk across the field to a neighbor, George Gardner, where Booth purchases a horse that was partially blind in one eye. Booth arranges to have the horse put on it, to have the horse shot, and to take possession of the horse Tuesday morning. Booth spends Monday night with the Mudds. We don't know for sure where Booth was on Wednesday, Tuesday, and Wednesday night. In all likelihood, he probably was with the months. I'm gonna get a sip of water here. Oh, and on December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, Dr. Mudd goes into Washington, ostensibly to buy his wife a Christmas present. He bought her a new stove. He's a romantic devil. A new stove. But he goes to the National Hotel where Booth was staying. He meets up with Booth. Booth and Dr. Mudd are walking north on 7th Street toward the Surratt boarding house when who should be happen to come becoming the opposite direction, but John Surratt Jr. It's Dr. Samuel Mudd who introduced John Wilkes Booth to John Surratt Jr. And thereafter, Booth was a very frequent visitor at the Surratt boarding house. Sometimes he was there twice a day. If John Jr. wasn't there, Booth would meet with Mrs. Surratt.
I gotta go the other one.
Okay. As ridiculous and absurd as it sounds today, kidnapping President Lincoln would not have been that difficult. The Secret Service, as we know it, didn't exist. It would take the assassination of 3 U.S. presidents, Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley, before somebody said, maybe we ought to protect this person. Lincoln did not like being guarded. In the summer times, he lived out in a cottage at the soldier's home, and he would frequently ride in the evening alone from the White House to the cottage. If he were in a carriage, he did not like having Union cavalry escort the carriage. So the plot to kidnap Lincoln was simply find Lincoln somewhere on the outskirts of town, preferably in his carriage. Find Lincoln, have sufficient men to overpower the driver and subdue Lincoln and drive off. It was that easy. So Booth's big chance came on March 17, 1865. Lincoln was scheduled to go out to a soldiers' hospital, Campbell Hospital, on the outskirts of Washington, to see a play, Still Waters Run Deep. So that Booth, with the exception of David Harold, and I'll talk about Harold in just a minute, gathers his gang together. They're on the outskirts of Washington. They're waiting for Booth for Lincoln to arrive in his carriage. They wait and wait and wait. Lincoln doesn't come. Lincoln had changed his plans and stayed in Washington. In fact, he attended a ceremony at the National Hotel where Booth was staying. So the conspirators dispersed.
Yeah, we get that.
Yeah, that's it. Booth was concerned about being pursued by Union cavalry. So he wanted to have some firepower. And he had purchased 2 Spencer carbines. Now, back in those days, if you had a rifle, whether it was muzzle loaded or breech loaded, you had to put the powder in, put the bullet in, use the ramrod to pack everything down, pull the hammer back, put a cap on, aim, and fire. Now, if you were really, really good, you could fire up to 3 rounds in a minute. Not that many people were that good. A Spencer carbine could fire up to 8 rounds without being reloaded. It was virtually a machine gun of its day. So Booth puts the carbines in his buggy. He tells David Harold to go down to Surrattsville, wait at Surratt's Tavern. After we grab Lincoln, we'll swing by the tavern. It's on the way to the Potomac. We'll pick you up, we'll pick up the guns, and we'll make our getaway across the Potomac. Now, Harold's down in Surrattsville and at Surratt's Tavern, and he doesn't know what has happened. Booth can't call him, he can't text him. Lincoln and Oshko were not coming. He doesn't know what to do. So he ends up spending the night in the Surrattsville area. And the next morning, he's got the carbines back in his buggy and he's making the trip back to Washington. Harold is not a happy camper. It was not, there were Union pickets, Union patrols along the way. It was not illegal to have a Spencer carbine, but it was unusual. And it was really unusual to have 2 Spencer carbines. So if Harold was intercepted, he would have some explaining to do. So as I said, he was not a happy camper. But on his way back to Washington, he runs into John Surratt Jr. and another conspirator by the name of George Azerot. And Jr. says to Harold, calm down, calm down. I know where we can hide the guns. So they go back to Surratt's Tavern and they hide the guns in rafters above the family dining room. And they push them far enough back. His houses routinely got searched back then by soldiers. You didn't need a warrant, you just needed brute force. And so they pushed him back. If we had a flashlight, you probably could have seen it, but a lantern, no, it would have been very difficult to be able to see them. Now, so the guns are tucked away at Surratt's Tavern. Keep in mind that Mrs. Surratt was in Washington. She was not at the tavern at the time the guns were hidden there. Okay. A couple of weeks after the aborted kidnapping plan, things are not going well for the Confederacy. They flee from Richmond, the city is evacuated, the Confederate government is gone out of Richmond on April 2nd, 1865. A week later, Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. Suddenly, the plan to kidnap Lincoln makes no sense. If you get him, what are you going to do with it? There's no Confederate government left in Virginia. There's not even a Confederate army left in Virginia. So, in mid-April of 1865, what's the one thing the Confederates needed more than anything else? We needed time. They needed time for the Confederate government to get relocated and reestablished. And they needed time for remnants of these armies who refused to surrender to make their way south into North Carolina. They're going up through the country. How do you create time? You create time by creating chaos. The modern view of that is you attack, command, and control. So Booth's plan went from kidnapping the president, next slide please, to decapitating the Union government, specifically to target Abraham Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State William Seward. Why those 3? Because presidential succession in 1865, when president, vice president, and then the president was down of the United States Senate. That was a guy by the name of Lafayette Foster, but that's not on the clear. Lafayette Foster, but Foster would not have become president. He would have become acting president until such time as the Secretary of State, and the law was quite specific, Secretary of State reconvened the Electoral College, and they would elect a new president to fill out the remainder of the term. Question:
Does an acting president have the same powers as the president? Does an acting president have the power to appoint the new Secretary of State? Who knew? It had never been done before. Acting president is not the term defined by the Constitution. So it would have taken some time to answer these and some other questions that were bound to pop up with a new person. Okay. The boost opportunity comes about on April 14th, 1865. Lincoln is going to play Our American Cousin, and Booth gets his conspirators together, and he says, I will kill the president. He assigns the task of killing Vice President to George Surratt, and the task of killing the Secretary of State to Lewis Powell. Next slide. About 2:15, Booth shows up at Mrs. Surratt's boarding house. He's got a package that is about yay big, and he gives it to Mrs. Surratt and asks her to take the package with her when she goes to Surrattville that afternoon. Question: how did Booth know Mrs. Surratt was going to Surrattville that afternoon? The answer is we don't know, but there had to be some form of communication. Either they met or somebody else passed information, but there had to be some form of communication between Booth and Mrs. Surratt prior to 2:15 in the afternoon. So Mrs. Surratt and a boarder by the name of Lewis Whiteman make the 12-mile trip from the boarding house down to Surrattsville. John Lloyd is not there. Mrs. Surratt, when she moved to Washington, had rented the tavern and farmland out to John Lloyd, who was a retired DC policeman, for the sum of $500 a year. So Lloyd's not there. So they have to wait for Lloyd to return. Lloyd comes back in about 45 minutes. He's offloading stuff out of his wagon to the kitchen. And Mrs. Surratt goes out and has a conversation with John Lloyd. Nobody's within earshot, but there are several witnesses, including Emma Offutt, who was John Lloyd's sister-in-law. Mrs. Lloyd wasn't there, but his sister-in-law was. And there's some family lore about how close those two were. And Lewis Whiteman sees them talking as well. Now, Lloyd would later testify that Mrs. Surratt, quote, told me to have the shooting irons ready that night. There would be some parties who would call for them. Now, is Lloyd telling the truth, or is he just trying to save his own neck? To me, the most damning evidence against Mrs. Surratt was the fact that when Booth and Harold arrived at Surratt's tavern about 12:15 a.m., Lloyd had the guns out of hiding and waiting for Booth and Harold. Next one, please. So Booth's got his plan, about 10:15, 10:20. He's out in the vestibule outside of Lincoln's box. He's waiting for the funniest line in the entire play, Our American Cousin. That line goes, don't know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal. You suck, dodgerizing old man trap. Apparently, in the Victorian era, that's funny stuff. Laughing from the ground. Booth goes into the box, takes the single shot Derringer, and fires it behind Lincoln's left ear. Major Henry Rathbone, one of Lincoln's guests, gets up to grapple with Booth. Booth drops the Derringer, pulls out a knife, and tries to plant it into Rathbone's chest. Rathbone parries the blow with his left arm. The knife wins and slices Rathbone from his elbow to his armpit. then jumps over the balustrade, goes to the center of the stage and yells, "Semper Tyrannis," but always to tyrants, the state motto of Virginia. Excellent. He runs out the back door, mounts his horse, and rides off into the night. About 20-25 minutes later, he arrives at the Navy Yard Bridge, which goes across what they call then the eastern branch of the Potomac. Today we know it as the Anacostia River. Booth is stopped by the sergeant of the guard, Silas Cobb, who said, "Don't you know the bridge closed at 9 o'clock?" Booth said, "No, that's news to me." But Booth is able to talk his way across the bridge. But Cobb says, "I'll let you cross. Why are you out riding?" Booth says, "I was waiting for the moon to rise so I'd have some light," which made sense. So he goes to the Cobb says, "You can't come back into Washington until daylight." And Booth said, "I assure you that will not be a problem." So he rides off into Maryland. About 10 minutes later, a second later, David Harold comes along and Cobb stops him, says, "Why are you out so late?" And Harold says, "Well, I've been with a prostitute and just now got away." And so Cobb says, "Okay, I'll let you go across the bridge, but you can't come back in town. Good morning." Harold said, "That won't be a problem." And the concern at that point was not people leaving Washington. It was people coming into Washington. So it wasn't, as I said, Silas Cobb had some discretion and had a reason not to let these two individuals out into Maryland. While Booth was shooting Lincoln, Hal goes to the home of William Seward. He knocks on the door is answered by William Bell, and Hal goes into his act of having a small box in his hand. He says, "I come from Dr. Birdie. I have medicine for the secretary, and my instructions are to deliver it in person." And Bell said, "No, the secretary is retired for the evening, he's not to be served." Hal pushes Bell out of the way, starts up the steps. Frederick Seward, the secretary's adult son, hears the commotion downstairs. He comes out of his bedroom and starts down the steps and comes face to face with Hal. Fred says, "Who are you? What do you want?" "I come from Dr. Birdie. I have medicine for the secretary, and my instructions, blah, blah, blah." And Fred says, "No, that's not going to happen. You have two choices. You can either give the box to me, or you're going to have to come back in the morning." So Hal's shoulders droop. He turns as if he's going down the steps, but he turns all the way back and around, having pulled out the revolver. It's cocked. It's point blank aim at Fred Seward. Hal pulls the trigger, and the gun goes click. It misfires. Hal doesn't have time to recock it, aim it, and fire, so he uses the gun to bludgeon Fred Seward. In the process of doing that, he breaks Fred Seward's skull, but he also breaks the gun. He bends the ramrod, the cylinder will turn, and so the gun is useless. So Hal drops the gun, pushes the badly injured Fred Seward out of the way, and goes into the secretary's bedroom. Next slide. He jumps on the secretary's bed, and he's trying to slash Seward's throat. 9 days earlier, Seward had been in a carriage accident and been thrown from the carriage, broke his jaw in 2 places, and also his right arm. Seward was using a metal headrest that helped keep his broken jaw in place while he slept. Hal can't see it, it's darkened, it's a darkened room, but as he's slicing away, he manages to slice open Seward's face, blood everywhere. Seward eventually was able to roll off the bed, between the bed and the wall. Hal ran out of the house, and all he attacked 5 men at Seward's house that night. All 5 survived, including Fred and including the secretary. And Hal rides off into the night. Next slide. You can see the right side of Seward's face. He's sustained very severe nerve damage as a result of foul attack. And that's why pictures you see of Seward are always of that profile. This is the only photo I knew of that shows him full face. As I said, he recovers in 1867, arranges for the purchase of Alaska, Seward Folly, and starts out the remainder of Johnson's term. Next slide. George Surratt goes to the Kirkwood House where he is to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson. But Surratt never, he's in the hotel, but he never makes it to Johnson's fleet. He never makes it past the bar. He stops in for a glass of liquid courage and another, and just ends up wandering rather aimlessly through the streets of Washington and makes no attempt on Johnson's life. Next. You get caught up with David Harold and Louis Booth. They met up, they rendezvoused at a place called Soper's Hill in Maryland. It's about where Branch Avenue and the Beltway near Washington, where Branch and the Beltway connect. There's no hill there anymore. That all got full of those. But from there, next slide, please. They went to Surratt's cabin. That's where Harold jumped off of his horse. He went over to the door, started pounding on the door, saying, "Lloyd, make haste and get those things." Apparently, Lloyd didn't have to be told what those things were. Lloyd came out having the field glasses, having one of the carbines, and turns around to get the other carbine. And Booth said, "No, don't bother. I've broken my leg. I can't ride and carry a carbine." And then Booth said something very curious. He says to Lloyd, "Do you want to hear some news?" And Lloyd, who'd been drinking most of the day, said, "I'm not particular. You can tell me if you want." And Booth says, "I'm pretty sure that we have just killed the president and the secretary of state." And with that, Lloyd or Harold and Booth go back down the pathway to the road, Duke-Out Road, and turn south. Now, Lloyd is the unhappy camper because he figured he's going to be questioned. They're going to search the house, and he didn't want to be caught with Spencer Carbine.
No.
Again, he would have some explaining to do. So he takes the carbine, ties a rope around it, and lowers it in a little storage area that was outside the bedroom, former bedroom of Mary Surratt, and lowers it along the wall of the family dining room. Now, Lloyd says that the rope broke. That's nonsense. I'm virtually certain that Lloyd cut the rope because he didn't want somebody to see the rope and go, "What's at the end of this rope?" "Oh, Spencer Carbine hidden behind the wall." Why is that? In any event, the rope either got cut or was broke, and the gun fell all the way down to the floor. So Lloyd is right. The house is searched. Lloyd is questioned, and Lloyd basically said, "You know, I've been drinking that day. I really don't remember much about anything." And the legend is the soldiers threatened to hang John Lloyd out by his thumbs. Suddenly, Lloyd's memory got much better. Yes, two men here. I gave one the carbine, and the other carbine is behind this wall. Now, they never would have found that carbine until the house was demolished if Lloyd hadn't spoken. So George Cottingham, a detective, took an axe, shot through the wall, and lo and behold, it was a carbine. That carbine came out of that wall and is now in possession of the National Park Service at Ford's Theater. Okay, next. Within hours after Booth had shot Lincoln, they knew that Booth was the assassin. They knew that Booth had a relationship with John Surratt Jr. And they knew that Mrs. Surratt ran a boarding house on Main Street. So authorities show up at the boarding house about 2:30 a.m. Saturday morning. Lincoln's still alive. And they're looking for John Wilkes Booth and John Surratt Jr. So they search the house top to bottom, looking for the two men that had come away at the end, because Booth was on his way to Dr. Mudd by that time, and Surratt was in Elmira, New York, on a courier Secret Service mission. Now, keep in mind, the men were not there to collect evidence; they were there to find the two people they were looking for. So, Mrs. Surratt had all day Saturday, all day Sunday, and all day Monday to get rid of any incriminating evidence that was in the house. I'm not saying she did that. I'm merely pointing out that she had that opportunity. By Monday, the authorities had no clue as to where Booth is. So they go back, the decision is made to interview, to question everybody in the boarding house, and bring them all downtown to do that. The detectives are given the wrong address, they go back downtown and get the right address, go back to 8th Street. So it's about 11 o'clock, a little after 11 p.m. Before they're rounding people up, they're waiting for a transport to bring everybody in. And about 11:30, there's a on the door. And the authorities open it up, and there's a powerfully built young man, a pickaxe over his shoulder, who takes one look at the detectives and says, "I think I'm in the wrong place." And they said, "Well, whose house were you looking for?" And the man said, "I was looking for the home of Mrs. Surratt." "Oh, you've come to the right place." So they pull him inside and the door behind him. "What is your business with Mrs. Surratt?" "She hired me to do some work around the house tomorrow, and I was just stopping by at 11:30 p.m. to find out what time she wanted me to start." Interesting. "Mrs. Surratt, will you come here? Did you hire this man?" "Before God, I swear I do not know him. I had never seen him before in my life, and I did not hire him." So they invite the young man to join the patty wagon party. They take him down to General August's headquarters. They send for William Bell, the doorman at the Seward household. Bell walks in, takes one look, and that's the man who attacked Secretary Powell, Secretary Seward. It was, in fact, it was Powell. After he left Seward's house, his horse came up lame. It's believed he spent a couple of nights in the cemetery, which is where he had a pickaxe, and had very, very bad timing showing up as Mrs. Surratt was being taken downtown for questioning. Bad timing on his part, it didn't help Mrs. Surratt's case either. Booth and Harold are on the run for 12 days. They were eventually cornered in a tobacco barn at the home of Richard Garrett in Caroline County. Harold says, "Good enough, I'm done, I'm out, I'm surrendering." Booth is determined to fight his way out of the barn. He is eventually shot by Sergeant Boss at Corbett, paralyzed him instantly in the neck, and Booth died on the Garrett's front porch a couple of hours later. In all, 8 people were put on trial for the murder of Abraham. The trial was to be held before a military tribunal. It was controversial then, it's still controversial today. But there are 3 legal concepts you need to keep in mind when considering the military tribunal. Next. First of all, they were not tried as civilians. They were tried as enemy combatants. And I'll let you, I'm not going to explain to you, but they were tried by enemy combatants. The second is a legal term called vicarious liability in a criminal conspiracy. What does that mean? That means that if you're part of a criminal conspiracy, you can be charged with the most serious crime committed in the course of that conspiracy. The classic example of that is if you're the driver of a getaway car and a bank robbery, and the robbery goes south and a guard is killed. The driver of the car can still be charged with felony murder, even though the driver never set foot in the bank. He didn't pull the trigger, but that's vicarious liability. And the third legal concept. Okay. A year after the conspirators' military trial, the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, ruled in a case called ex parte diligence that civilians could not be tried in military tribunal if civilian courts were operational. Now, did Milligan reverse the conspirators' conviction? The only time that was ever tried was in a case brought on behalf of Dr. Mudd, ex parte Mudd. Allergy. Ex parte Mudd. And the judge, Thomas Jefferson Boykin, ruled that in this case, the president was shot to impair effectiveness of military operations. He was the commander in chief, and therefore he had no. Therefore, the offense was military offense, and that the proper tribunal likewise was a military one. That case has never been overturned. In fact, it's been cited as precedent. Most recently, in a case brought on some detainees down in Guantanamo, but that case has never been overturned. I'm not going to talk at length about the trial, other than to give you a timeline. Began in early May. They had 360 some odd witnesses who testified and began deliberations on June 29th. The sentences were approved by President Johnson on July 5th. 4 of the conspirators were sentenced to be hanged. Louis Powell, who attacked Seward, George Azarot, who was supposed to be Johnson, David Harold, who was captured with food, and Mrs. Surratt. Few people thought that Mrs. Surratt would actually hang because of her gender and her advanced age. She was 42. But they thought that she would have a sentence commuted. Her daughter Anna, 2 of Mrs. Surratt's lawyers, a guy by the name Aiken, a guy by the name Clampett, went to the home of District Court Judge Andrew Wiley and persuaded Wiley to issue a writ of habeas corpus, commanding General Winfield Scott Hancock to hand Mrs. Surratt over to the court at 10 a.m. 10 a.m. comes and goes. General Hancock, he shows up about 11 o'clock and he's empty-handed. And he's very apologetic to Judge Wiley, but says the president has to suspend the writ. And Judge Wiley supposedly has said, the president has an army. I have a bailiff. There's nothing more I can do. Whether that's a true story or not, great story, so we stick with it. But Anna Surratt goes to the White House to try to meet with President Johnson to beg for her mother's life. Johnson refuses to see her. In fact, Johnson posted guards with fixed bayonet outside of his office. And the only person we know who got in to see Johnson was the widow of Stephen A. Douglas, Adele Douglas. I think Mrs. Douglas correctly assumed that the guards were not going to shoot for the bayonet to the widow of Stephen Douglas. He went into Johnson's office, she was not in there that moment, and keeping him out in Bolana. There was nothing that can be done because this is unmoved and was not. So on a very hot July 7th afternoon in 1865, Mary Surratt became the first woman ever to be executed by the federal government. From left to right, that's Mrs. Surratt, who was pal David Harold, George Azariah. Now, that where the scaffold was, is now part of Fort McNair in Washington. In fact, it's right outside the officers' club there, and is today a tennis court. So, in addition to the dubious distinction of being the first woman ever to be executed, Mrs. Surratt was born, what is today a golf course, and died on today a tennis court. Like I said, you can't make this stuff up. The 4 conspirators were sentenced to prison. Dr. Sanders, 3 of them were given life sentences. Dr. Mudd, Michael Olaf, and Sam Arnold, who were part of the original kidnapping plan, and Ned Spangler. Ned was a stagehand at Ford's Theater, and his only crime was he did Booth, and Booth asked him to hold his horse. Well, Spangler had work to do during the play, so he handed the reins over to Joseph Peanut Burroughs, who got his colorful nickname by selling peanuts to the patrons during intermission. Next. They were sent off to Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas off of the Florida Keys, and this place happened to be just popular. Everything that was used in the fort had to be brought in by ship. You'll notice they didn't have any high guard towers because the guards kind of figured if you guys somebody wants to try to escape, you go swim with the sharks, knock yourself out. So it's still today it's run by the National Guard Service. What about John Surratt Jr.? Well, as I said, Surratt was in Elmira, New York, makes its way to Canada, Mexico. In the fall of 1865, he sailed across the Atlantic to England, then down through France to Italy, where he became a Zoa. We can go back to this. He became a Zoa, papal guard. I think he just liked the clothes. But he thinks he's operating under an assumed name, John Watson. But he's recognized by a former classmate of his, who the classmate has dollar signs dancing in his eyes. He thinks he's going to get a huge reward. He's going to be disappointed. But he's turned in and captured. But he makes a very dramatic escape back to America, and makes his way to Alexandria, Egypt, where he is again arrested, brought back to the U.S., and put on trial. The next slide, please. The passions of the Civil War by this time had diminished greatly, and there just wasn't the thirst for blood that there was right after assassination. And so the trial was made before a civilian court and a civilian jury, which was composed of 8 Southerners who weren't about to convict John Surratt Jr. of jaywalking, and 4 Northerners. So the trial ends in a hung jury. They tried to bring additional charges against Surratt, only to make the determination that the statute of limitations, 2 years, had already told Surratt that it was actually set free. Next. In 1870, Surratt decides to take advantage of his fame, cash in on it, and he's going to deliver a series of tell-all lectures about food, about conspiracy, his role in it. He does his first one in December of 1870 to a packed house in Rockville, Maryland. He's charging the princely sum of 50 cents for the lecture. Surratt does the second lecture in New York City at a fall place, Cooper's Union, He does a third one in Baltimore. But by this time, people are figuring out, he really isn't telling us anything that we haven't read in the paper. And so the interest is, much is diminished. He never delivers to lecture in Washington. He goes up to Emmitsburg, Maryland, where he becomes principal of a boys' school. Eventually, he settled in Baltimore, married a relative of Francis Scott Key, the Star Spangled Banner guy. They have 7 children. He becomes an auditor for a steamship company. And that's and spends the rest of his days in Baltimore. It was said that he was working on a manuscript, but shortly before he died, Surratt took all of his notes and all of his papers and threw them into the furnace. And so when John Surratt Jr. passed away in 1916, he was the last of the Lincoln conspirators, and he took his secrets to his grave. Next. What about Isaac? Isaac came back from Texas in the fall of 1865. He came back. He never married. He also moved to Baltimore for the same company as his younger brother, and died in 1907. Anna, in 1869, in a very small private ceremony, married William Connery, a chemist who worked for the Surgeon General of the Army. In 5 days after Connery married the daughter of Mary Surratt, he was fired. No reason for it. But he goes on and had a very distinguished career as a chemist. They had 5 children as well, lived in Baltimore. And Anna died in 1904, and she was said to be a very nervous person. So I'm going to wrap up. And I'm going to wrap up with pretty much where I started. And that is, by a show of hands, how many of you now think Mrs. Surratt was guilty? How many think she was innocent? Very good. My purpose tonight was not to try to convince you of her guilt or innocence, but present the facts as best we know them. You might make up your own one. And hopefully, if I've enticed you to do a little more consideration or reading or research on the subject, then that is really what I was set up to do. So I thank you very much for having Lisa and I meet up here in Hershey. And I'll be happy to try to answer any questions. Before I do that, I'm going to present. Yes, sir.
Ladies first, go ahead.
Do you think she's guilty?
Do I?
Yeah.
My personal opinion? Yeah, she got what she deserved.
But how could she not make?
Why? Her son was a trusted courier. How would she know about the existence of the carbine, where they worked, and that they had to be made ready? The only source of that information had to be her son. Why would her son bring her into the plot if she were not party to them? So as I said, to me, that's the most damning evidence against Mrs. Surratt, is she knew the existence of the carbine, and they had to be gotten out of line, and obviously they were ready for Booth and Harold.
Bill, just curious question. I've read some that probably not enough about it. Did Booth hatch this all by himself, or was he working this out with Benjamin or other officials in the Confederate government? There seemed to be a lot of politics that he didn't know about that was at play with what he was trying to do.
That's a great question, and it would be a whole nother lecture at another time, but I'll do it very briefly, and that is, Richmond wanted Lincoln dead. We know that because the day before Richmond was evacuated, April 1st, 1865, the Confederate Senator Thomas Harney, who worked for what they call the torpedo bureau, with explosives to blow up a portion of the White House with the cabinet. During a cabinet meeting. Harney was handed off to Mosby, who was supposed to get him through the Union lines and into Washington. There was a brief skirmish outside of Washington in an area that's Springfield, Virginia today, and Harney was captured. Now Booth knew that Harney had been dispatched, and that isn't a whole complicated issue, but there's sufficient evidence from testimony given by George Azarot that Booth knew that he set somebody up in the White House. So draw your own conclusions, but I think there's pretty strong evidence out there.
Like more reading.
Yes,
sir. Thank you. Did John Lewis testimony got convicted of?
John Wick's testimony and Louis Whiteman's testimony as well. And you know, Lloyd's testimony was specific as to this is what she told me. And Whiteman's testimony from this point, I saw them talking to each other. So she kind of corroborated Lloyd's testimony as much as anything.
Two questions. Where was the son's trial, or be the civilian trial?
Washington DC.
It was in DC.
In DC, it was a southern town.
Absolutely.
So it wasn't too surprising that it ended in Hunter.
If it would have been a civilian trial rather than military tribunal, do you think they would have been convicted, or?
It would have been really difficult to find somebody who was
Unbiased.
Yes, unbiased for the South.
Actually, probably both ways, wouldn't it? Southerners who may applaud his success, Booth's success, and also the mourning of the country on the other.
I think it would have been very difficult to secure a guilty verdict in either one of those trials.
Or at the Capitol
Right.
killing,
Yeah, correct.
perhaps life, or if they were convicted at all.
Yeah, I think that's correct.
Sure, I think this would be of interest to someone. I just was on the internet, and if you look up, I've Got a Secret, 1956, and you've seen this, okay? And it's the last person who witnessed the assassination. And the this poor little guy in there, he's about 96 years old. He saw he was 5 years old. He did see Lincoln come in, he didn't see the shooting, but then he thought a guy fell out of the balcony.
Yes,
Okay?
that's exactly right.
Yeah, you just like that, I've Got a Secret, the Lincoln assassination episode, and it'll probably come right up.
I think you said something about how it came over and how.
If the story can't come out and tell his mother about it, first see it, why?
That's one of the conclusions.
Do we have a smoking gun that says, hey, mom, guess what? We got these guns. No, but how else would she have known? How could she have possibly known? No. So that's why I think she killed me. That's why I think John Surratt Jr. told her about the guns. Lloyd's testimony. Why would he have had the guns out that night if Mrs. Surratt hadn't told him to do it? Right. Yes, ma'am. We have the transcript, yes. No, Mrs. Surratt did not testify and could not testify because under the Fifth Amendment, it was believed that no defendant could testify in his or her behalf because you were sworn to tell the truth, and if you told the truth, you would incriminate yourself. So the only place where defendants could testify on their own behalf was in the state of Maine. No, she did not, but none of the conspirators testified.
Peripheral question, the 1937 Long Beach one in Oscar was being done, right?
There's no return.
Yeah, and that movie saved everybody the day. Is there any truth to that? I mean, I think it's a God.
Well, again, another lecture for another time, but the Mudd and three other conspirators go off to Fort Jefferson. And while they're there in 1867, an epidemic of yellow fever breaks out. And the first victim of yellow fever was the camp doctor. And so Dr. Mudd was the only woman left that had training. And at the time, they didn't know the mosquitoes that carried yellow fever. And it took Walter Reed until 1901 with that. So Mudd stepped in and is taking care of those who can die with the virus. It is said that because Mudd and the three of the others were ultimately pardoned by President Johnson very, very late in Johnson's term. It said that he was pardoned for humanitarian reasons because of passion during the yellow fever outbreak. That's true nonsense. The story, the reality is Andrew Johnson was a very bitter individual and very unhappy that he had not been nominated and elected president in 1868. And he was also very mad that he'd been impeached by the House, tried by the Senate, and avoided being removed from office by one vote. And that vote was probably as a result of a heavy drive.
Yeah.
So Washington. So they were. He was very bitter, and so it's the closing days of his administration, and he's going, "What can I do to affront all those I consider to be my political?" I know. I'm going to pardon Dr. Mudd. No, that's not enough. I'm going to pardon Sam Arnold. No, that's not enough. I'm going to pardon Ned Spangler. He would pardon Michael McLaughlin, but McLaughlin died from yellow fever. So Johnson does that, and says, no, it's just not enough. I know. I'm going to release the bodies of Mrs. Surratt, who first named Lewis Powell to his family, to David Harrell to his family, and George, I was thinking ahead and got ahead of myself. Azariah to his family, but now that's not enough. I'm going to release the body of John Wilkes Booth to his family. And you know why I'm going to do that? Because I'm the president and nobody can stop it. So that it's a nice story that Dr. Richard, who is Sam Mudd's grandson, told the story of compassion and humanitarian reasons. It just isn't true. Yes, sir.
Question. You said that the ruling that allowed for the military tribunal has never been challenged and is still.
No, the ruling that ex parte Mudd was specifically asked to interpret whether ex parte Milligan, the later case, applied to the conspirators. And the judge that had heard that case said, no, Milligan does not apply to the conspirators. That judge's ruling Judge Boynton's ruling has never been overturned.
I'm trying to figure out, most of us here are old enough to have lived through the Kennedy assassination. And we were told at the time that the federal government had no power to intervene in the investigation of that murder.
That is, and that's correct. The laws changed somewhat since then, but yes, all of that, the investigation into Kennedy's murder was done under, the Dallas police force. But yes, you're right.
We weren't at war though. With Lincoln, we were still at war. They were still fighting down in the Carolinas. I know Kennedy, no war. Vietnam hadn't kicked in officially yet.
Officially.
I'm not trying to explain anything, just, you know, that
could
might be
stretch that
another
either way.
option.
So there's one more here.
Involved in kidnapping plot, right?
What that said,
Involved in a kidnapping plot before you said.
with mud.
Yeah.
That's been debated. George Aznavour, in his testimony, he made a confession. He thought he was going to get away scot-free since he didn't make an attack on Johnson. Aznavour says that there was supplies left with Dr. Mudd for the kidnapping. I have not had any corroboration that, but there it is at the state. Again, thank you very much for having me.
Okay. Get on where first. He's in the water.
Oh.
Oh, thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Let's give Mr. Finger a minute. Yeah, thank you, everybody. And thanks, Frank. June the 20th is going to be Jonathan Stackman and talking about I got my glasses to read. No field here, the Lincoln leadership and the real backstory of the Gettysburg Address. And also, don't forget, there's still some books back there for sale too. So if not, we'll thank you and we'll see you all next month.